Welcome to the second part in our series on Nietzsche's will to power. In the first part, we went over the necessary philosophical background. We quickly reiterated the main points of Schopenhauer's concept of the will to life and the philosophical movement inspired by Darwinism that sought to explain all natural phenomena, including human behavior, from a materialist lens. Despite apparent agreements between Darwin and Schopenhauer, there is a huge point of contention between the two systems of thought. Schopenhauer advanced a metaphysical theory, while Darwin championed a materialist theory which has no need for metaphysics. As we shall see, Nietzsche struggled with this dilemma when trying to formulate his own concept of the will to power. The question that looms over the will to power, even today, is the following. Should we understand the will to power as a metaphysical concept or not? The purpose of this video is to go through Nietzsche's works in chronological order and trace the evolution of the concept of the will to power in Nietzsche's own intellectual development. The fact of the matter is that there is simply no single will to power in Nietzsche's work. A lot depends on which conception you choose to single out for discussion, because, as we will see, the concept has evolved throughout Nietzsche's thinking. The Joyful Science, a theory of power. In The Joyful Science, we see the first systematic treatment of power in Nietzsche's works. It's only one paragraph long, and Nietzsche doesn't use the term will to power yet. Rather, the paragraph is about the feeling of power, which is also the title of the paragraph in question. In it, Nietzsche describes how desires for cruelty and feelings of power are linked. Both pity and cruelty are emotions linked to the practice of power. The first, pity, signifies a lack of power, while cruelty is associated with an increase in power. But we can see how the will to power is taking root here. The first sentence is illustrative. We exercise our power over others by doing them good or by doing them ill. That is all we care for. Notice how Nietzsche is restricting himself. The feeling of power seems to be a human affair. Can animals feel power? What about plants or rocks? The feeling of power seems to be restricted to organisms with a certain degree of intelligence, presumably only humans. If we go back to the question we asked ourselves earlier, is the will to power a metaphysical concept or not? We can see how at this stage of Nietzsche's development, the answer is no. The feeling of power which Nietzsche describes here is only applicable to humans. Therefore, we are closer to Darwin than we are to Schopenhauer. We are not in metaphysical territory. Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, we see the first mention of the term will to power in Nietzsche's works. In chapter 34, we even get a definition of sorts. The will to power is the exhausted, procreating life will. Later, Zarathustra says, "Wherever I found a living thing, there found I will to power, and even in the will of the servant found I the will to be master." But the content of the concept seems to have changed in between the Joyful Science and Zarathustra. An earlier section, chapter 15, describes Zarathustra's travels through many countries, where he encounters many different peoples. What they all have in common is that each adheres to a different system of morality, of good and evil. Zarathustra remarks that the labels good and evil are simply value judgments created by man himself. Different definitions are used by different communities, yet all of them seem to flourish all the same. Zarathustra exclaims, "A table of excellencies hangeth over every people. Lo, it is the table of their triumphs. Lo, it is the voice of their will to power." Human systems of good and evil, which is to say, all systems of good and evil, are simply an expression of a stronger underlying will to power. Making a value judgment, assigning values, is a creative act and therefore an expression of the will to power, and it seems that humans cannot escape this impulse. Values that man only assign to things in order to maintain himself, therefore calleth he himself man, that is, the valuator. In Zarathustra, the will to power seems to be a decidedly human phenomenon. It is primarily concerned with value judgments and ethical systems. Man exercises his will to power by creating values and systems of good and evil. Beyond Good and Evil, published 3 years after Zarathustra, explores the concept further, beyond human affairs. Of all Nietzsche's works, Beyond Good and Evil has the most references to the will to power, with the term appearing in 11 aphorisms. In aphorism 36, Nietzsche seems to suggest that the will to power might actually be a metaphysical principle, independent of human affairs. Or rather, the reader is invited to make the thought experiment. If nothing in the world is given as real, except for our desires and passions, is it not permitted to make the experiment and ask the question whether this which is given does not suffice for an understanding even of the so-called mechanical or material world? Nietzsche takes the thought experiment very far. It's part of his larger exercise in Beyond Good and Evil to question the hidden assumptions philosophers before him have had, without realizing it. We have a video dedicated to the will to power as it appears in Beyond Good and Evil. We highly recommend you watch it. There is a link in the description. By the time we get to Twilight of the Idols, the time for thought experiments has passed. The traditional confounding of that which is the least real, the illusory world of our desires, passions, and senses, with what is most real, the Kantian Ding an sich, is subject of a particularly scathing passage. Nietzsche speaks of the mistake of philosophers to confuse the last for the first. The highest concepts, that is to say, the most general, the emptiest concepts, at the beginning as the beginning. In essence, Nietzsche invites us to think bottom up instead of top down, where philosophers have traditionally posited God, the last, thinnest, emptiest concept, as the ens realissimum, the most real thing. We should regard our basest desires and passions, in short, our will to power, as the most real thing instead. In fact, so-called higher concepts, such as God, become unnecessary to explain the world if we accept that the will to power is the ens realissimum. Where in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche was still talking in terms of a thought experiment, in Twilight of the Idols he seems to regard the will to power as a very real metaphysical principle underpinning all of reality. The Antichrist is the last complete book Nietzsche himself wrote. The concept of the will to power has not changed much from Twilight of the Idols to the Antichrist. But some famous quotes are found here and they might make things a bit clearer. What is good? Whatever augments the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is evil? Whatever springs from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that resistance is overcome. Life itself appears to me as an instinct for growth, for survival, for the accumulation of forces, for power. Whenever the will to power fails, there is disaster. The Antichrist is more about what happens when will to power is lacking, whether it be in religion, individuals, people, or society. A lack of will to power is décadence, degeneration, weakness. We will explore the concept of décadence more in another video. Finally, we have the posthumous work with the title Will to Power. We will not discuss that work here. The simple reason is that this book was not published in Nietzsche's own lifetime. It consists of loose notes compiled by his sister after his death. For that reason, the work is not generally considered to be canonical. However, if there is enough interest, we might do a separate video in the future. If you'd like to see it, please comment below. However, it's obvious that toward the end of his life, Nietzsche saw the will to power as more of a metaphysical principle than he had at the beginning of his intellectual career. Conclusion. We see how the will to power was first introduced as simply an observation on human behavior in the joyful science. In Zarathustra, the will to power takes on the form of the creative, valuating part of the human spirit, common to all humans and maybe even to all organic life. In Beyond Good and Evil, we are invited to a thought experiment. What if the will to power was simply a grand theory of everything? Is the will to power enough to explain reality, human behavior included? Is the will to power a metaphysical undercurrent, influencing a simple rock as much as it does mankind? Finally, in Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche rails against the philosophers who have complicated metaphysical systems with God at the top in what he calls a grave error of taking the last for the first. We simply do not need God or a metaphysical, complex system to explain reality. All we need is the will to power, as if the thought experiment of Beyond Good and Evil had become reality. Let's go back to our first dilemma. Is the will to power a metaphysical concept, like Schopenhauer's will to life? Or is it simply a physical theory of behavior, like Darwin's natural selection and struggle for life? It seems Nietzsche himself moved from Darwinism back to Schopenhauer-style metaphysics towards the end of his intellectual career. The will to power has undergone a transformation from a human instinct or drive to a mysterious force underpinning all of reality. However, it would also be a mistake to call this metaphysics. Nietzsche's opinion in Twilight of the Idols is actually very straightforward. He rails against metaphysical systems. He is quite obviously opposed to a metaphysical dualism in the sense of Schopenhauer. Yet some sort of dualism is still needed in order to understand the conception of the will to power of the late Nietzsche. A materialist doctrine simply does not allow for a vocabulary to formulate something like the will to power as Nietzsche envisioned it in his late period. Yet he is also opposed to metaphysics in this traditional sense. Nietzsche himself struggled greatly with this dilemma. He was working it out, but could not finish his own work due to his mental illness, which left him incapacitated for the last 11 years of his life. Perhaps it is up to us to finish the task. We will see you in part 3 when we conclude this series. If you want to be notified when that video is released, or if you just want to support the channel, please click like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.